John Y.H. Bai is a postdoctoral researcher at the Faculty of Education and Social Sciences at the Karl von Ossietzky University of Oldenburg. He completed his PhD in psychology at the University of Auckland, New Zealand, where he worked as a research fellow and lecturer. In collaboration with the international team at the Center for Open Education Research, he is currently working on a project, Prospects for the Future of Learning, Artificial Intelligence Applications in Higher Education, funded by the Volkswagen Foundation and Lower Saxony Ministry of Science and Culture. This international project aims to collect perspective of higher education faculty to contribute to the interdisciplinary and multi-stakeholder discussion on AI and society. His research interests include artificial intelligence, research design, and interaction between individuals and their environment. You agree with me that Dr. John Bai is experienced and competent to speak to this topic. Dr. John Bai, please.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Felix, for inviting me and for, let me see. Let me see about sharing the screen. There we go. Is that coming through okay? Is that coming through okay?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, excellent. Good. All right. Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me. Like Felix said, my name is John. I am a postdoc researcher at the University of Oldenburg here in Germany. This face comes from China, the accent comes from New Zealand, and the research comes from Germany. So because New Zealand accent is quite hard to understand and we mumble and talk quite fast, if any point during this I'm going too fast, feel free to flag me and I'll try to slow down. Felix asked me today to speak about the legal, societal, technological, and pedagogical issues surrounding the use of AI. I was very happy to see Dr. Musoni's first slide was on regulation. So I'm glad she'll be doing the heavy lifting on the legal. I have less of that. I'm going to talk more about the technological issues around AI and generative AI and what that kind of means for the social and the pedagogical side of applications. So I want to start off first with definitions, because I think this is a root of where a lot of misunderstanding happens and a root of where a lot of these issues come from. All right. So if you look up the definition of artificial intelligence, you'll see something like this, which has been used by UNESCO, something around the idea of machines imitating or even exceeding human cognitive capacities. So from the very start, we're comparing artificial intelligence as a metaphor for human intelligence. It kind of works like this, we think, right? You can trace this definition all the way back to the Dartmouth summer research project, where McCarthy and colleagues defined a working assumption, right? That they said the study is to proceed on the basis of the conjecture that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. So this definition then comes from a working assumption. If we know how the brain works and we can describe exactly what it does, then we can tell a machine to do exactly what the brain does, right? Of course, since 1955, a lot has changed, and we've figured out that we actually don't know that much about how brains work. And putting aside this whole idea of human intelligence and all the nasty eugenics roots of this concept, the fact is we don't understand human brains in a way we can describe it very precisely, and we can't have machines that do or process information like our human brains do, right? So a warning, a very important warning, comes from the IEEE on their report on ethically aligned design. And they note that there is a danger in uncritically attributing classical concepts of anthropomorphic autonomy to machines, including the use of the term artificial intelligence, right? If we call it artificial intelligence and we think, oh, this is something that's just a version of human intelligence, then the expectations of how we interact with these models, what we expect from them, how we expect them to process things, how we interpret the outputs, that all gets colored by this metaphor. And this metaphor only started as a working assumption, right? So the thing that's going to come up over and over again is that the sociological and pedagogical issues around the use of AI often comes from us humans misinterpreting what the AI is doing. And a great example of this is through these things called adversarial examples. Adversarial examples are stimuli that are designed to test or to reveal gaps in how an AI model is processing some information or some piece of stimuli. One of my favorite examples of this comes from AI as applied in education, and it's this thing called the Babel text generator. Babel text generator stands for Basic Automatic BSSA Language Text Generation. This was designed by Perelman and his colleagues as a kind of tongue-in-cheek critique of automated essay scoring machines. So automated essay scoring it does exactly what you think it does. You give it a whole bunch of essays and it says, this one's probably A, this one's probably a B, this one's probably a C, right? No humans, well, very few humans required to mark a whole bunch of essays, right? The thing is, the problem with this automated essay scoring idea is that computers don't read essays in the same way that humans do, right? Instead, what they do is they look at features that are correlated with good essays and bad essays. And so what Perelman et al. Did was design a text generator that spits out text to fool these automated essay scorers. And so what it'll do is it'll generate text that reads like this. So if you don't have your screen on, I'll read it out for you. The text reads, still yet, armed with the knowledge that the report with infusion can petulantly be the injurious stipulation, none of the lamentations by my circumstance compel inconsistency but agree. And by experience, many of the quips at our personal admonishment on the allocation we countenance collapse or disrupt risibly unsophisticated precincts. If that sounds like nonsense to you, that is because it is in fact nonsense. It is meaningless, completely rubbish text that doesn't have any semantic meaning embedded in it. But a computer doesn't recognize meaning, right? What the computer recognizes is, hey, look, there's a lot of uncommon words being used in this essay. There's a lot of complex sentence structures, and there's a lot of markers for argumentation. So what Perelman et al. Found was if you put text like this, that is semantically empty, but that has all the features of an impressive looking essay, if you put that into an automated essay scoring machine, then it will spit out some prediction that says, this is a really good essay, right? Let's give this essay an A, right? And so this distinction then between how humans mark essays and how machines mark essays is one of the core issues that I want to be emphasizing. The core issue being that of construct validity. Construct validity, just basic scientific research, just means, are you measuring what you think you're measuring? You have this AI system that is supposedly judging the quality of the essay. So the thing you're interested in measuring is the quality of the essay. But of course, quality is such a nebulous concept. How do you define it? How do you measure it? How do you give data into the machine to try tease apart what is high quality versus low quality? And what the machine does is it uses a bunch of features like word length or average word length or average or essay word count, or the relative distribution of common versus uncommon words. These are all features that it uses, right? And these features are proxies of quality, right? So the thing to keep in mind is, are we measuring what we think we're measuring when we're using AI models? This is important in terms of pedagogy, in terms of just thinking about assessment. Can we get an accurate read of how high quality an essay is by looking at these features? But this is also a more fundamental issue with all AI models. Are the data that we're putting into the model actually reflections of the things we're interested in measuring? Or are they just convenient things that it's easy to put a number to, and therefore easy to put into an AI model, right? This is going to come up more, but just to pre-warn you, the other reason I wanted to start with Babel is you can look at Babel, this text generator, as an early example of what's been trademarked now as generative AI. There's a lot of hype, a lot of buzz going on. Babel is relatively harmless because it's designed specifically to produce nonsense, right? But now what we're seeing is a lot more interest in these newer forms of large language models which are designed to produce what they call human-like text. Felix has mentioned that you guys have covered this before in the previous few weeks, so I won't go through these slides in too much detail, but I'll just give you a quick overview. We're all comfortable with the idea that large language models are prediction machines. That is, they predict sequences of strings based on the associations that's learned through its training data. That training data is massive. It's a huge amount, and it comes straight from the internet, or mostly straight from the internet. Right. The sheer amount of data that's been scraped from the internet to train these models makes these models really, really costly to train in terms of infrastructure, in terms of compute power, in terms of even energy. We're talking millions and millions of dollars to train up some of these larger language models. The sheer amount of data also makes it really hard to audit, right? There's so much data that no human can actually read through the data and check what's rubbish and what's not, what's true, what's false, what's propaganda, and what's more accurate, right? Both of these features are going to be problems when we start thinking about how we use these large language models in everyday life, right? Taking a step back, another way to think about it is these large language models are probabilistic text generators. So what they do, how they generate output, is they sample tokens from a distribution of likely candidates. So here's an example on the right classic example from Holtzman et al. 2020. If you give a model like ChatGPT the following prompt, I ate pizza while it was still, and ask it to complete the sentence, then what it'll do is it will sample from a distribution of likely candidates, right? So as you can see, hot is the most probabilistic likely answer, followed by cooling, warm, on, so on, so on. By the time you get down here, you're getting into cooking, baking, in, cool. These are less likely. They have a small probability of being selected, right? But because this data comes from the internet, and because there's all manner of things on the internet, what you get is you actually get a really long tail of very unlikely words that each have a very small probability of being collected or selected. But when you add them all up, the cumulative probability is actually quite high. So what you get is what Holtzman et al. Call an unreliable tail. So an unreliable tail of this distribution, if you were randomly to select from this distribution, most of the time you get something nonsense, right? So there's a lot of really interesting work in this area about trying to sample from up here in the head of the distribution versus down here at the tail. Regardless of how you sample, the fact is you're still generating the output through probabilistic sampling, right? Contrast this with what I argue humans do, which is more of a purposeful selection. We try to choose the words that accurately translate what I'm thinking in here to what you're hearing into your brain, right? So again, harkening back to the IEEE's warning about the dangers of anthropomorphic thinking, is if we start interpreting the output of large language models as the result of some kind of purposeful selection process, then we become in danger of a whole bunch of misinterpretations, right? There's a lot of good critique out there on large language models. The best one, my go-to one, the one that I would recommend if you read nothing else, is this one by Emily Bender and her colleagues, who described large language models as a system for haphazardly stitching together sequences of linguistic forms that's observed from its vast training data, according to probabilistic information about how they combine, but without any reference to the meaning of the words, right? That is, they are stochastic parrots. Really good paper, really worth reading, right? Because the generation of text is through probability, these large language models are prone to producing two kinds of artifacts. These are firstly hallucinations, which I'm sure you guys have talked about already. It's the thing that's capturing a lot of media attention. But the other thing that it can produce is even worse, in my opinion. These are memorizations. Memorizations are exact sequences of words that come directly from the training data. This doesn't sound like a big problem, but if you think about the training data coming from the internet, and you think about all the information that gets put onto the internet, a lot of personal information, you might try to scrub it from the internet. As soon as it's swept up by a web crawler, it's there and it's potentially being used to train the model, right? So on the right is an example from Kalini et al., who showed that if you experiment with the kinds of prompts that you input into, in this case, GPT-2, you can get the model to release that very sensitive personal data, including an individual person's name, email address, phone number, fax number, and physical address, right? They found that this is possible even if this data is only in one document in the training set. So it doesn't have to be a well-known person with a well-known address. As if it's represented in one document, it is possible that that can leak out through the output of these large language models, right? So if you think about hallucinations and memorizations, suddenly you open up a whole discussion on the problems that you have when you try to apply it within education. So issues such as privacy and data protection of personal data, the spread of information, which the dialogue around information has been mainly around propaganda and political shenanigans, I guess. But as educators, if we think about it, this is quite similar to the reaction to when Wikipedia was emerging, where people were worried that students would look at a Wikipedia article and be like, that's it, I understand this concept. I don't need to research more, right? Because there's nothing that terminates the pursuit for knowledge quite like this illusion that you already have knowledge, right? So in this case, if you're interacting with the language model and it spits out something that sounds very confident to be true, but is fake, and you don't train your students to follow up on that and find other sources and cite other sources, then we're in a potentially pretty bad situation there as educators. There is, of course, a lot of chatter about plagiarism, and with memorizations, that plagiarism might be intended or not, right? So you could ask ChatGPT to give you a definition of AI. If you copy and paste that into anything and put your name on it, you don't know if that is directly from some other source, if that's a memorization, and you might have just plagiarized and put your name on something that actually comes from someone else, right? So a lot of big issues there. If we take a step back and look at it, look at the problem where, because it's so widespread, because everyone knows about it and a lot of people are using it, the sheer amount of artificially generated text kind of brings into question our whole relationship with how we as humans interact with text, right? And other media, of course, right? So within education, we use text, essay text, as a way of seeing if a student understands or how much they understand of a concept that we've been teaching in lectures, right? That is a way for us to get at, have you understood what I'm trying to teach you? But of course, now in a world where you have AI models that can generate essays, AI models that can mark essays, and AI models that can check for plagiarism, Rudolph et al. Bring up this interesting dystopic fiction future where a first AI circumvents a second AI and is assessed by a third AI. All that the humans do is press a couple of buttons and nobody learns anything, right? So with all this chatter and use of AI models to generate and mark text, are we losing what it is that we're trying to do with education, right? From a more broader sociological perspective, one of my favorite quotes is from Floridi and Girati, who note that the availability of these language models represents a rival of new age in which we can now mass produce good and cheap semantic artifacts. And this phrase, good and cheap semantic artifacts, has been living rent-free in my brain, but it makes us question what is the value that we put on text, right? What is a good text? What is the norms that we have when we approach different types of text? And how does that change when there's so much text that is just being mass produced as with these language models, right? I'm going to take a step back now, even further, and look at training data. Felix, I'm seeing that my time is running low. Do I have time to go through another few slides? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay,
you have
great.
You have 7 minutes.
Excellent. Perfect. Yeah. Okay. So if we look at the training data, this is where a lot of the issues arise. Okay. Because if you imagine what these models are being trained on is data from the internet, and data from the internet is not representative of data in what Raji et al. Called the whole wide world, right? So we've got the World Wide Web, but what goes onto the World Wide Web is not representative of what goes on outside, right? So my favorite example, I always ask my students, if I'm interested in whether my friend is feeling happy or sad, would I go on his Instagram and look at his pictures, right? And the answer is no. You won't look at that because people don't put themselves sad on the internet, right? Especially on Instagram. So online, you have almost a sampling bias, right? Because people are more likely to put photos of them happy or laughing onto the internet, you're going to have more data about them laughing and happy than you are of them sad. This has a lot of issues that have been well documented for a really long time, right? So I want to give some props to some really groundbreaking work by Joy Lamwini and Timothy Guber, who were looking at computer vision and facial recognition stuff back in 2018, right? So what they did was they analyzed two open source data sets. These data sets, collections of images of faces. And when they assessed these data sets, they found that most of them, the majority of those data sets were full of lighter skinned females and lighter skinned males. In this case, the IJBA, 60% of those faces were lighter skinned male faces, right? This is a problem because these data sets are used for training models for facial recognition for all sorts of purposes, including gender classification. So what they did to assess what impact this might have was they created a balanced data set by merging some faces from parliamentarians across a whole bunch of different countries to have a balanced data set where each of these four categories are fairly equally represented. Using this data set, they then tested two commercially available at that time, commercially available facial recognition algorithms to look at gender classification. What they saw was that these proprietary APIs, they performed really, really good for lighter skinned male subjects. Their error rates were between 0% and 0.8%. So really, really accurate. But then you compare that, they were making error rates between 20.8 to 34.7% for darker skinned females. So this is intersectional, right? So on average, it was better at classifying lighter skin than darker skin. On average, they were better at classifying males and females, but it's intersectional. So it's worse for darker skinned females. And so this really makes us question, right? What is the data being used to train these models that we're relying on, right? Because if it's imbalanced data, it's going to give us inaccurate results. If you have a very homogeneous population and you're only using it for white Americans, then okay, it's performing great. But because the data is curated by humans and not balanced, there's so many human decisions there that what these models can do is they can perpetuate stereotypes and kind of dominant viewpoints, right? And this becomes even more problematic when we think about media that is generated by AI, right? So as a good example, here's a link that you can go play around with after this workshop, where you can explore what representations feel these models are trained with in terms of different occupations and different adjectives. And unfortunately, the results are quite unsurprisingly depressing, as you might imagine. Straight from the horse's mouth, here's something that Google research acknowledges in the limitations of their imaging projects. They say the data requirements of text-to-image models, these are image generation models, have led researchers to rely heavily on large, mostly uncurated web scrape datasets. These datasets often reflect social stereotypes, oppressive viewpoints, and derogatory or otherwise harmful associations with marginalized communities. While they do use their own proprietary curated data that we don't have any access to. They also use this open dataset called the Lion 400 million dataset, which is open source. And this dataset is known to contain a wide range of inappropriate content, including pornographic imagery, racist slurs, and harmful social stereotypes. This can have real consequences for the users and the use of these generative models. As Melissa Haikila, who's a tech journalist for the MIT Tech Review, notes, she reports on experience that she had with a avatar app, which is an image-to-image generation app. You upload a bunch of your selfies, then it creates art of you to use as your profile picture, basically. So her colleagues used this and they got really cool results, like them as an astronaut or them as a cowboy. Melissa, she's of Asian heritage, she's an Asian woman. When she uploaded her photos, what she got is a whole bunch of photos of her nude or semi-nude, and a whole bunch of her crying for some reason. Because so what she concludes is, what she argues is that because the internet is overflowing with images of naked or barely dressed women and pictures reflecting sexist, racist stereotypes, the data set is also skewed towards these kinds of images, right? That has real effects for how we raise our kids and what kind of images they get raised around, what kind of expectations they have around particular body types or particular features or particular stereotypes, right? Big problematic thing. I'm gonna kind of pick on this Lion project only because it's open source. There's a lot of data that is hidden behind proprietary data sets that we just can't get access to. Lion is open source, so good on them for being open source, but it's a project that's based in Hamburg in Germany. Because it is subject to the European Union's GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation. And so on the FAQ page, they have a process for if you find your personal data in the data set for some reason, if you're a citizen within the EU, you can ask for them to take it down. Technically, they're wrong. It's not just citizens of EU, but like anyone who's living in the EU. So even a non-German like me, because I'm living in Germany, can apply to have my data taken down. This is problematic, right? Because legally, the protection that we have and the rights that we have on our own data really depends on what policies are in effect in the place that we live, right? They don't apply to everyone equally. And this pattern where people residing in wealthier Western countries are afforded more protections and more rights to their data is really problematic when we view it in the context of how we got to this place, right? So here's Bernheim, an excellent essay on the algorithmic colonization of Africa. She argues that this discourse of mining people for data is reminiscent of the colonizer attitude that declares humans as raw materials free for the taking. Right, somewhere closer to home for me, growing up in New Zealand, Tauru is a Maori scholar. So New Zealand was also a British colony with all the baggage that comes from that. Tauru argues that the use of proprietary licenses, that is licenses to make money off with Maori data, could be considered the same as the natural resources and land that was confiscated during colonization. So this pattern of coming into taking people's cultural heritage and monetizing that, while the people that own that data, own that heritage, don't see any profits, that's unfortunately a pattern which we've seen in the past and something that's getting repeated today, right? So really dark, unpleasant. What do we do? Where do we go from here? There's no clear answers. This is a quote that's worth reading. Felix, I see you. I'm over time. Here's a few starting points. If you're actually interested in what I'm doing, it's got very little to do with much of what I've said, but if you're interested, here are some links, and then I'll end it there. And thanks very much.
Thank you very much, John. That's a very great presentation. I have a lot to say, but for want of time, I like that you mentioned Floridi, Abena, and the likes. Wonderful, wonderful ideas there. And I particularly love that you focused on pedagogical and social as well. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to go ahead and present Dr. Musoni's bio, and we take her right away. Melody Musoni is a digital governance and digital economy policy officer at European Centre for Development Policy Management, ECDPM, a think and do tank based in the Netherlands. She's also the founder of Africa Conversations, an initiative uniting African voices to explore how artificial intelligence shapes social, economic, and political realms, with a focus on effective regulation. Melody's areas of interest are on Africa's digital policy landscape, spanning projects on artificial intelligence in Africa, AI sovereignty in South Africa, gender and criminality in cyberspace, digital ID in Africa, approaches to digital sovereignty, data localization in cybercrime investigations, to mention a few. A seasoned speaker, Melody has contributed to global forums like the Internet Governance Forum, the Transform African Summit, and engaged with institutions such as the European Union Digital for Development Hub and the OECD. Before joining ECDPM, Melody worked as a data protection senior expert and advisor at the Southern African Development Community Secretariat. Melody has a decade-long experience in both legal practice and academia, where she specialized in privacy law, cybersecurity, and information technology in South Africa. She holds a PhD degree in cybercrime law and cloud computing law, a Master of Laws degree in cyber law, and a Bachelor of Laws degree from the University of Witwatersrand. Please join me to welcome Dr. Melody Musoni. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Titilola. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. I just wanted to confirm if you can see my slides, my presentation.
Yes, we can see it. I can.
Okay, so I don't need to introduce myself. I didn't realize that is going to be a very lengthy bio, but thank you for the introduction, Titilola. So I'm just going to go straight into my presentation. I understand that my instruction was to have a discussion specifically looking at the legal challenges associated with AI deployment. I don't know, I can hear like background sounds. Is it coming from me or someone is not on mute?
Yeah, it's from someone else.
Okay, it has stopped now. So I'm going to just have a discussion in the next 20 minutes looking at specifically the legal challenges that are associated with AI deployment. And I think that as the demand, of course, for AI in Africa particularly is increasing, and the world as well, as the demand for AI is actually increasing, we need to have that discussion around the risks that are associated with AI, because there's a lot of risks that come with the use of AI, with the deployment of AI. And it becomes very important for us to have a discussion, particularly looking at how best can we regulate artificial intelligence. And what's important to note is that if we are not careful in how we approach regulation of AI, of course, we'll end up having bad regulatory frameworks whereby the risks that we are trying to address are not properly addressed, and we end up stifling innovation and the development and use of AI. So it's quite important for us to have a discussion on regulation of AI. And there, what I did was, for purposes of this presentation, I just came up with 3 questions that in the short space of time that we have, we can actually look at why do we actually need to regulate artificial intelligence? And if we agree on the reasons why we need to regulate AI, how then should we go about regulating AI? And looking specifically at a region like Africa, the next question, of course, would be when should we regulate? And this question on the when part, the timelines, specifically because of the pressure that a lot of African countries are now facing, especially now that in Europe we now have the EU AI Act. So there is that increased pressure on African governments that we need to regulate AI. So we need to ask ourselves, of course, when is the right time to regulate artificial intelligence? And what I did when looking at the question of why we should regulate AI, I just want to discuss 3 or 4 reasons which justify regulation of AI. And we know what's important when we have a discussion on regulation is we want to ensure that the development and deployment of AI is actually safe. We want to make sure that it's ethical, it's transparent, and there are real benefits which can be experienced by everyone. So we need to have that inclusive development of AI, and there are inclusive benefits to everyone. So when we talk about regulation of AI, it also helps to balance innovation with the protection, fostering of an environment where AI can be leveraged for positive outcomes while minimizing the potential risks and harm. So the first point that comes to mind as to why we need to regulate is the need for legal certainty. So you understand that when it comes to legal principles and legal rules, there is a need for that certainty. And what's the challenge that we currently face is that technology always outpaces regulation. If you recall, when we started experiencing disruptive technologies, especially in the fintech sector, where people started making use of blockchain technologies or the use of cryptocurrencies. At the time when these new technologies were introduced, there were no laws which particularly addressed or dealt with such disruptive technologies. And that was quite concerning for regulators in the financial services sector, because they were not so sure. For example, if we look at crypto, they were not so sure how best to regulate it. Are we going to consider cryptocurrency as legal tender? Are we going to consider it as an asset for purposes of taxation and issues like things like that? So because of that, there were now questions on how best do we regulate. And the same thing if we look at the internet itself, and especially with social media when it was first introduced, there were also questions on how do we regulate cyberspace? Should we regulate, and why do we need to regulate? And with the increase of all those risks that came about, it was justifiable that actually we need to have a discussion on regulating these technologies, because if we have clear rules and clear legal principles, it actually helps us to achieve or ensure legal certainty, to be in a position where we understand what people's rights are, what obligations individuals have, what obligations governments have, or what obligations companies and organizations have. And that is also one way in which we can maintain safety and security. And if we don't have these legal principles in place, what is going to happen is in instances where we have certain unlawful conduct or harmful conduct rather, which is being carried out and violating people's rights, for example, such conduct will go unpunished because we don't have the laws in place. So it's actually important for us to have that conversation on regulating AI, because we want to have that certainty from a legal perspective. And when we look again at the question of risks, one of the main reasons that is actually leading and bringing to light the question of regulating AI is particularly the question of risks. So you see there is a lot of policy debates focusing on how best can we ensure safety and security in how we use AI, because there are so many risks that come physically, financially, psychologically. And I'm happy that Dr. John talked earlier on about issues on bias, for example. Those are some of the challenges that we now have and the risks that come, especially when it comes to gender bias or exhibition of bias, especially when it comes to race or religion. So that can also be quite risky on individuals, and we need to actually protect people's human rights by regulating AI. And what's also important is, especially with AI in particular, is the question on privacy and data protection. So as more and more of these technologies are being used by us and are being used by companies, there is a lot of our personal data being generated in the process. And if we are not careful how we use AI technologies, or how governments are using AI technologies, especially surveillance technologies, then there is a risk of infringement of our privacy. And if we look, for example, in the context of political rights, civil political rights, for example, we need to have access to information, and we need to have free flow of information. But now with the trend of use of AI, especially deep fakes, especially when it comes to election campaigns and election season, there's a lot of disinformation that is being circulated. And already that is an indication of some of the risks that comes when AI is not being regulated. And these risks actually are harming our rights, our fundamental human rights as our fundamental human rights. So it's quite important for us to have that conversation on why we should regulate AI. And then there is also the question of accountability and responsibility and liability. So in law, what we understand is that with all rules and principles, we need to be able to determine liability. And one of the examples that we normally discuss when talking about regulation of AI in particular is that case where if I'm driving a vehicle and I do not do a proper lookout and hit someone, I will be held liable for that accident and the harm and the any physical or emotional damages that a victim would have sustained. And in the event of me maybe using an autonomous vehicle where I'm not the driver, it's an AI system that is actually driving the vehicle, the question becomes, who then can be held liable in the case of an accident and someone else, a third party, getting hurt? So in such situations, we do not clearly know who can be held accountable, and it's not clear what legal rights and legal recourse are available to any victim or anyone who might be prejudiced, or anyone who might have their rights infringed. And because of that, it becomes important for us to actually develop or come up with regulations that will help us to have that legal certainty, as I explained earlier, and be able to come up with principles that can help us in identifying who can be held accountable or who can be held responsible for any act that can be performed as a result of AI. And that becomes a bit tricky because there could be different actors involved in the AI ecosystem. So there could be you as the user of AI, but you bought the system maybe off the shelf, or you bought it from a company and the company actually imported the technology from elsewhere. So we end up having so many actors involved within the AI ecosystem, and that becomes quite difficult from a legal perspective on who can be held accountable in the case of harm happening and who can be held liable. And just to add to that conversation, one of the policy debates that we have in Africa is particularly on the dominant role that big tech companies play in Africa and the AI and data ecosystem. So if you are to look closely at which companies are actually providing and offering AI tools and services in Africa. It's predominantly foreign-owned companies. Some of them do not even have a physical presence in Africa. And that, from a jurisdictional perspective, can be tricky in the sense that should something go wrong and there is unlawful processing of data, or there are any risks that come as a result of using imported AI tools, most African governments are not able to hold these foreign-owned companies or foreign-based companies accountable. So you'll be in a situation where you are experiencing harm in your country. A company comes, they're offering services, be it in the education sector, but there are risks that come, and they are unlawful or non-compliance with the law, but you are not able to actually hold them accountable because they don't have any physical presence, they don't have any legal presence in your country. And that can become quite a challenging task for most African governments. And you see now the discussions now are mainly focusing on how best can African governments contribute to the AI ecosystem. And there is that discussion of, well, we need to actually focus. Someone is not on mute. So now there's that discussion on perhaps it's important for us to have AI which is made in Africa for Africa, which is kind of the mantra that we currently have. And having that in place will also address such issues of finding or holding different actors liable. If an AI developer is within your continent or within your country, it's much easier for you to actually hold them liable should things go wrong. And the other two reasons which also help us to explain why we need to have to regulate AI is looking at what the law does. So if we have a law, it's not just going to regulate specifically AI as a technology, but when we have laws, they are there to create an enabling environment. And we understand that AI is actually playing a significant role when it comes to economic and sustainable growth in Africa. And now Africa is striving towards achieving that digital single market where we share data, where there is cross-border flow of data, where we take advantage of all the benefits that come with data. So in order for us to benefit from that AI market and that AI ecosystem, we need to have other laws. So it's not only laws that are regulating AI as a technology, but we need to have laws that are going to attract investments. We need to have intellectual property laws that will provide clarity on different issues, for example, software, issues on copyright, issues on patents. And if we have an AI technology being used, for example, when it comes to generative AI, that question comes to mind. If a generative AI is able to come up with a good essay, who should have the copyright, who should be considered the author of that essay? So we need to have those discussions as well within the intellectual property space. And even in the context of patent law, I know not so long ago, the Patent Office of South Africa actually granted an AI-based system to be an inventor. So you see some countries approaching AI and considering an AI system to have that legal personality where it can be considered as an author, or it can be considered as an inventor. And interestingly enough, in countries like Saudi Arabia, for example, they even at some point granted an AI system citizenship. So that question, of course, becomes, can AI actually be considered as legal persona? What does that mean if we have a system, a technology that now has legal system which can sue or be sued? How do we go about that? So there are different issues that come when we are looking at regulation, even from a data governance perspective. Who can have access to such data? What can they do with data? Dr. John was speaking earlier about training data sets, and those are collection of that data to begin with. How do we go about it? So looking at AI, at law, it plays a role for in creating that enabling environment that we actually need to make the AI ecosystem work. And of course, when we can't talk about law without also mentioning a bit on the ethics side of things, because we know a lot of our AI products and a lot of our technologies in Africa, they are actually imported. So we use a lot of non-African data sets. And the challenge with importing these data sets is that they don't always reflect our context as Africans. For example, the issue of language. Most generative AI platforms, they don't really recognize a lot of African languages. And even in the education sector, a lot of products that are used in edtech, they are mainly in English, French, and to some extent Arabic, and there is not a lot of such products being offered in local languages. And there the questions become, especially when it comes to algorithmic bias, how do we go about that? Because if we are going to use data that was originally biased maybe towards women, we're given examples from the work that Dr. Joy and team are doing on algorithmic bias. How do we go about it if we are now importing data solutions that relied on data that was already biased? What does that mean when we deploy these AI systems within our African context? Are they going to help us to reflect our African context? Are they going to help us to actually solve African problems? So what should we do? And there again, law comes into play, and it plays a big role in actually helping us to come up with guidance that can help throughout the AI lifecycle. So from the development of the AI system, the designing, the deployment of AI system, we can have laws and regulations that are providing guidance on how to go about it, ensuring that there is ethical, responsible, and safe and trustworthy systems that are being deployed and, of course, being developed in Africa. So those are some of it's not all the reasons why we need to regulate AI, but it just helps you with the thinking on when looking at why it's important for us to have this question on regulation of AI. And the second part that I want to just briefly touch on is, of course, on how should we go about regulating AI. We know why the need to regulate AI, but how then should we go about in regulating AI? And why do we have this question coming up? It's mainly because law itself is a very broad discipline, and there are different fields of law where AI is already being regulated. So if you look, for example, within the context of data protection and privacy, we now have several laws that regulate personal data and the processing of personal data, ensuring that we respect and we promote data privacy. And in Africa, I think as of today, about 36 African countries or 37 African countries have these data protection laws in place. And what's important to note about a lot of these data protection laws in place is that they also have specific provisions which deals with online profiling and which deals with automated decision making. So where you have an AI system or an autonomous system that is being used to process personal data, you automatically need to comply with such laws within the data protection sphere. And at a continental level, just to make a note there, we also have a continental convention on data protection. It's called the Malabo Convention, which also provides the principles that need to be complied with when you are processing personal data. And that a convention also came into operation last year after it was ratified by 15 countries. So from a continental perspective, we already have some form of regulation which is addressing issues of AI and data protection. And outside of data protection, the discipline of data protection and privacy, we also have other areas, for example, within cybercrime and cybersecurity laws where aspects of AI are actually being regulated. So, for example, I mentioned earlier that there is an increase in this use of deep fakes, especially when it comes to election season. And some countries, what they are now doing is they're using provisions from their cybercrime laws to actually prosecute people who are spreading deep fakes. And that can also help us in regulating AI. So instead of waiting to say, now we have a comprehensive law addressing AI, it's looking at different fields. Is it the field of data privacy? Is it the field of cybersecurity and cybercrime? Is it the field of intellectual property? I mentioned again the example with South Africa, where the patent office in South Africa actually recognized that an AI system can be an inventor. But of course, most countries, they are not, they're actually opposed to that notion of awarding legal personality to AI systems. So there are different fields where we can discuss issues of regulation of AI from a criminal law perspective, from a delictual law perspective, privacy law perspective, different ways of regulating. And what's important in looking at different ways that we can regulate AI is we need to promote transparency and we need to promote trust. So you see that when we have regulations, especially clear regulations on how we use AI or how AI actors actually develop AI and deploy AI, what should be of primary importance is that the processing activities in they are more transparent. And this is mainly something that we actually borrow from the EU AI Act, which adopts a risk-based approach, and they kind of classify certain risks, like risks where you are not allowed to use AI, and high risk and low risks. And there, in terms of the EU AI Act, they also require that when it comes to high risk AI systems, there should be a way in which we can ensure that it's traceable, and operations of activities or processing activities of AI are more transparent throughout its life cycle. So we will be able to actually know where we got the data sets from, how we went about developing an AI solution, and when it comes to the end user, what would be more useful for you would be to know if I'm going to engage. Maybe I go online on a website and I want to buy something online. I want to be able to know if there is any AI system or application that is being used. If I'm applying for a job, for example, I want them to be transparent, to let me know upfront whether they are going to use an AI tool throughout the to select or shortlist certain interviews. It's quite important to have those discussions. If I go to the bank and I'm applying for a loan, for example, I also need to know if there is an AI tool that is being used to make a decision whether I qualify for a loan or not. So that's part of the conversation. And also part of transparency is, in the event that I'm not happy with a decision that is being made by an AI, what can I do? There should be always that human oversight where I'm able.
Melody, can you begin to wrap up, please? I'm sorry, it's because of our time scale. Sorry.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, all right. Could you just do it in about a couple of minutes? Is that okay?
How many minutes do I?
You've actually gone 30 minutes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So could you do that? Thanks.
Okay. So the other 2 points there I wanted to make, of course, is on how do we go about, especially in Africa, we need to participate in discussions on global AI policy, and mainly because AI is a global phenomenon. So it's not just about Nigeria, it's not just about South Africa, it's about Africa, it's about the globe. So we need to be part and parcel of these discussions when it comes to how best we can regulate AI, and we should not just be standards takers. We also need to be part of the conversation on coming up with standards that we can adopt. And interestingly enough, the African Union has been making great strides in this space. We now have a continental AI strategy. We now have a data policy framework, and we have a white paper on responsible AI, which are all important instruments for Africa and African countries to help them in understanding the best way to regulate AI, and the same with ensuring international best practice. So if you're a government and you're thinking on regulating AI, you also need to know what is happening internationally, and you adopt best practice so that there is more alignment and harmonization between what you are focusing on. If you're regulating AI that is being developed in your country, you're coming up with standards. Those standards should also speak to international best practice as well. And then the final question there is, of course, when should we regulate AI? And I said earlier that this is an important question, especially for Africa, because of the Brussels effect and the pressure that African governments are receiving now from the private sector and from foreign actors on the need to regulate AI. And the question, of course, is when is the right time for Africa to regulate AI? Should it be a matter of wait and see to see how the EU AI Act, for example, is going to pan out in practice, and then see if you can at a later stage regulate AI? And what in our discussions, what we always advocate for is that at the moment, African countries should not prioritize adoption of AI specific laws, but instead it should be strengthening the foundational regulations we have, especially on data governance. I mentioned data protection laws that we have, the data policy framework, for example. Many countries are now adopting their national data and AI strategies. So that is a good way to start. Instead of jumping into having a law regulating AI, rather start with having a strategy in place. And I'm happy that Nigeria, you had that 1 week long discussion and workshop on coming up with your AI strategy and policy. So that is the best way to approach doing that. And just to wrap up this slide, I can share the slides later. It also gives you kind of a roadmap of where we are as a continent and what the African Union has actually been doing specifically within the AI ecosystem, starting with the working groups that were set up to look at different issues on AI, and now with the AU AI strategy that we now have in place. And of course, my last slide, different countries at different stages, but no country has a law specifically on AI. It's mostly the strategies or policies that are in place. And these are the countries at the moment that have their strategies and policies in place focusing on artificial intelligence. I think I'm going to stop there, and I apologize for.
Thank you very much, Melody. Thank you very much, Melody Musoni. Ladies and gentlemen, we've heard her. She overviewed the entire legal framework of not just AI, but all the other issues related to intellectual property, cybersecurity, and all whatnot. She framed it around 3 questions: why should we regulate AI? How should we do it? And when should we do it? Are there any questions for Dr. Melody Musoni and Dr. John Bai, who came earlier on? Are there any questions so that we can do the questions in the next 10, 15 minutes? I know our time is fast spent, but if we can take the questions, that'll be all right. While we're waiting for participants to think through their questions, I have a question for Melody. You said if I have this concern, if AI is made in Africa for Africans, would it be better than the AI that comes from outside Africa? Do you think, it's one of your proposals that we should have AI for Africa? Would it get around all the controversies and biases that we claim that AI from the north is providing? That's something. So while you are reacting to that, we'll wait for other questions to come in. Okay, Melody, do you want to address the question?
I can make my intervention. So that's a good question. So it's not a proposal that is coming off my head. It's actually one of the proposals that is coming from the African Union. When you look at their white paper on responsible AI, and of course their continental AI strategy, because there is a whole lot of geopolitics that come with it, and that question of, as African countries, we need to be sovereign and we should not continue to rely on foreign tech. We need to develop our own. So that's where the conversation is coming from. And as to whether it would be better than importing AI solutions from elsewhere, I think to some degree, yes, because at the moment there is a prioritization, especially when it comes to large language models, there is a prioritization of African languages, which is very important. So if you are going to invest in your own local languages and you have innovators working on coming up with, especially in the edtech space, coming up with solutions and products that reflect local languages, that will go a long way instead of having to rely on the US or on China to come up with a solution for you. So to us, to some extent, there is more benefit in having AI solutions being developed on the African market. And the second reason being, innovators on the African market, we already understand our problems. We know what our African problems are. So it's much easier if innovation is coming from within to develop solutions that can meet some of the problems and the challenges that we actually face. And then, so I would say, yes, to some extent, there is definitely a benefit in focusing on AI in Africa, made in Africa, and there are a number of benefits that come from it. And I think the work that some of the big tech companies are now doing is actually they're trying to collaborate with African innovators and developing those innovation hubs across Africa, because they see and understand the value of local innovation.
Thank you very much. Flavius, please ask your question. You just go straight to the point and direct your question to, let's know if it's John or Melody. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Felix. I was muted initially. I'm directing my question to Dr. Melody. That was an interesting presentation. I have concerns, especially when it comes to the use of AI in healthcare. And looking at the legal perspective, as you have rightly said, how can we really bring our people up to speed? You can't regulate what you don't really understand, and especially the use of AI in healthcare, that is tricky. How do we really handle this? I go with you on collaboration between the global north and the global south, but how do we bring our people up to speed, looking at the complexities of disease conditions in Africa? Thank you.
Should we take another one or I respond? I'm not sure.
Let's take one more. Let's take one more. Let's see if there is any other. Yes, Ilisami Olofintui, please unmute and ask your question.
Oh, okay. Yes. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. During the course of your presentation, you made mention of two terms that I would love you to explain. That is a high-risk AI and low-risk AI. I'll be glad if you can expatiate more on that. Thank you.
Thank you. So starting with Flavius' question on especially AI in healthcare, I think what's important for now is looking at there's importance of us to have awareness. So it starts with awareness and to have these stakeholder engagements where we actually bring awareness on different issues, especially from a data protection perspective, because a lot of people, especially working in the health sector, they really don't understand what data protection laws are and the importance of data privacy. So that could be a good way to start, where we have more awareness and more training on issues on data access, on issues on data protection, privacy within the AI space. And I think where there is use of different products, especially mHealth solutions, what is also important is also to understand where these products are coming in from and what type of data is being collected. So it all links back to the importance of data protection. So if we are able to understand, the people in the health sector are able to understand data protection and data privacy, and there is training and awareness, they will be able, even from a procurement perspective, to make that decision to say, we cannot procure these technologies because they are not meeting with the privacy and data protection requirements that we need to protect our patient data. So I think that should always be a good starting point for most African countries, and for people specifically in the health sector. And then coming to the question of risk. So if you get an opportunity to read the EU AI Act, it actually, I don't have it now and I haven't read it in quite some time. Maybe Dr. John can help me on this. So it identifies different types of risk. So high risk processing would be those processing activities that will violate your fundamental human rights to a greater extent. For example, use of surveillance technologies in public spaces. I think it's listed, and the use of social scoring, where I think it's a system. I'm not sure how much of it is used in China, but they've been mentioned that social scoring is actually used in China. So those are the two that comes to mind, but I can double check and we can have a bilateral on this. It's clearly set out in the EUA Act. And then low risk, I would say maybe if I have my phone and it also has AI, or my fridge has AI capabilities, that's low risk. It's not going to process a lot of personal data, and there are not so many consequences. So, but I will refer you to the EU AI Act. It gives you the different types of risk profiles and the examples of processing activities that qualify as high risk, low risk, and the third one, and what you need to do when you are processing data within one of the three.
Okay, thank you, Melody. We have two hands raised. Can I request that further questions should be directed to Dr. John Bai? He's also in the room and he presented us with very eloquent, gave us a very eloquent presentation. Anyway, Jude Ajobiwe, unmute and ask your question.
My question is just that, why are we segregating? Why are we having African AI apart from
okay,
that?
Thank you. She'll address that.
Okay, so I don't think we are trying to make a separation and say we just want to have African AI. It's more of wanting to promote innovation in Africa. I'm sure if you check on the research that is done, especially on data and AI, you actually realize that a lot of innovations are happening elsewhere. It's in Europe, it's in China, it's in the US. And there's not a lot of innovation happening in Africa. So if we talk about AI in Africa and for Africa, it's a way of wanting to promote local innovation ecosystems within our continent. And I think it's something that is beneficial for Africans if we have economically, and it also promotes our Agenda 2063 if we look at it that way. So it's more of promoting innovation ecosystems in Africa to address some of the challenges that we actually have in Africa, because there are limitations, of course, in having to rely on off-the-shelf solutions from elsewhere, or relying on foreign technologies as well. And from a sovereignty perspective, when you look into digital sovereignty, for example, there are also concerns for our governments, especially when it comes to surveillance. You don't want to be in a situation where all your surveillance technologies are being imported from Israel or from China, and you don't have anything that you are developing on the ground. What happens when there is political tension between you and these foreign actors? So it's always beneficial, socially, economically, and politically, to have innovation ecosystems in Africa and to promote our own local innovation. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question for John Bai, and of course, I realize that there's a howler there. I said, beyond prescriptions, what practical steps can we take to improve educators' understanding of ethical and sustainable AI? I know you cited Stefan Popnici in your presentation, and then, of course, I have also read parts of Stefan's book. but I'm wondering what practical steps we've always prescribed, the Melody just prescribed. You also made some prescriptions in your presentation. So, John, what practical steps can we take to improve educators' understanding of these ethical issues? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Dr. Musoni actually covered a lot of this in terms of having these conversations and multi-stakeholder discussions within a localized community about what are the problems that we're trying to use AI to solve. Like instead of a top-down process where you're just handed an AI tool that's off the shelf, developed somewhere, we're using some kind of data that you're not sure of. If we can change the conversation to have a ground up where the local community decides, hey, here are some problems that we're facing that AI tools could be useful for. How do we like tap into the community and the localized expertise to develop these tools within African context or within, more local context even. And yeah, I'm really appreciated learning from Dr. Musoni about the legal side of things, because I'm vaguely familiar with the General Data Protection Regulation, and I haven't really looked at the AI Act yet. But just to go back to what you were saying about the high risk, low risk thing, I think there's a whole chapter of the GDPR so there's extra compliance costs for these high risk AI applications. And I think a lot of it is the EU is learning from the examples set by the US. Unfortunately, some bad examples where there's a lot of fears about, especially within education, because kids can generate a lot of data. If you're tracking kids from a very young age, what that data is being used for is scary, because there are data brokers. That data is made available for sale to, for example, if an insurance company wants to buy your data and say, oh, look, you've got a family history of X, so we're going to increase your premiums. Or you have all these indicators, all these features that are associated with whatever bad negative outcome, therefore we're less likely to give you a job, right? So those kind of profiling things that can have a huge impact on the course of someone's life, those I think are under the EU's generally considered high risk. Yeah, but really interesting discussion. In terms of practical stuff, I'm afraid there's no like simple answers, but having these conversations, and Felix and what you guys are organizing here is a really good way to start conversations and start building an awareness and spreading these kind of discussions as widely as possible. Get everyone up to speed about what AI is, what it isn't, what it can do, and what are kind of just very convenient messages that these AI companies might want to spit out that increases their, they have financial incentives, but what are the narratives are there that reflect it more realistically, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. John Pai. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I think this is an appropriate junction to draw a line on this conversation. Our conversation still continues on the online discussion forum, which will open in the next few minutes. We're going to invite our speakers to see if they can join to respond to some of your questions. You can bring some of your questions to that platform. If their schedule permits, they will join and then respond to some of the questions as well. And on Friday, we have a live session to review what we have done over the course of the week. From me, it is Bai and the rest of the team at the now Notre Dame AI Ethics Project.